Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Danielle Citron.
Thank you so much. And for all of you being here, I know it is a beautiful day. So hopefully I can make up. I can't give you the sun in here, and I'm going to probably scare you a little bit. But I promise to at least make it worth your while. Thank you so much for being here. The Chicago Humanities Festival, it's so exciting and such a privilege to be part of this. So Allison, thank you. So the festival, of course, the theme is power, right? And so I'm going to talk about the internet's sort of wonderful capacity to empower all of us, and how, unfortunately, individuals come together, whether as determined individuals themselves or together with others as a cyber mob, to deprive people of all of the things, all of those opportunities, all that power that we can harness about living in a networked age, and the significance of those attacks, and how, where are there gaps in power, how can we wield it, what's missing, and what can we do about it as individuals, right, collectively, as companies, and as lawmakers. So let's just first recognize that, can you imagine 30 years ago, right, what the world looked like? Could we, network and find jobs and display our ideas? We could do it in sort of local, we could present it to people, right? We could write letters. But today, we can network and reach our ideas, can reach people who are 5 minutes and 5 hours away, right? It creates so many opportunities, network technologies, right? To network, to work, to get our, to have blogs that attract clients, friends. We meet our future spouses online, right? And so the tools that we now have enable so much of our lives, right? To work, to learn, to educate, to explore. And those are central to all of our life opportunities. But we see that unique power, of course, is recognized by people who want to deprive us of those extraordinary opportunities, right? To talk, express, to work. And they often come together as mobs to target individuals and deprive them of all of life's crucial opportunities. And often what we see, and I'm talking about the phenomenon of cyberstalking. So it's the targeting of specific individuals through a course of conduct that's designed to and causes severe emotional distress and often the fear of physical harm. And it's often a sort of that perfect storm of threats, privacy invasions, usually invasions of sexual privacy, so involving the posting of someone's nude photos without consent, or manufactured, fake pornography videos of someone. It involves defamation, so you accuse someone of having a sexually transmitted disease or being a prostitute and available for sex. And it's usually that combination of threats, privacy invasions, and defamation that when you search someone's name, right, a Google search of their name, they're looking for a job, they have a job, what you see are accusations that they're prostitutes, nude photos of them that suggest they're interested in sex, their home address, and threatening posts. And it can be really difficult to get and to keep a job, right? And especially what we see is that more often it's people in their 20s, and in particular, women and people of color, and people in the LGBTQ community. So it's, who does this really impact, right? It's women and people from marginalized communities, and often on an intersectional basis. So the darker your skin, right, that you're a woman and you're a woman of color or a gay woman or trans woman, right, it sort of fuels the fire. Now, the phenomenon itself, of course, is incredibly disempowering, right? People often go offline. It's silencing. They retreat. They feel like they have to, shut down their Facebook, their Twitter, their LinkedIn, because those are sources of vulnerability, right? That's how people target them. And they have great difficulties getting and keeping jobs, and doing all the things, all these wonderful life opportunities that the internet it enables, right? So I think it's really hard to talk about this without giving you examples, right? Because without understanding someone's experience, it just sounds like a whole lot of words, right? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about two people and their experiences, so then we can think about, well, what do we do about all this? How do we use sort of the power of network tools and society to address some of this? So Annie Seyfullah was a high school principal on Staten Island. And she had a relationship with someone in the parent, like a PTA, a father of a student at the school. And they fell in love, they had a relationship, they moved in together. And over time, the relationship frayed, and they began the process of breaking up. And the ex, she had an old computer where she was previously married. And on the old computer, there were photos of Annie in slightly undressed, in lingerie. And her ex-husband had taken those photos, and she had kept them on this old computer, which wasn't password protected. And the ex took those photos, transferred them onto her Department of Education laptop, brought it to the superintendent of schools, and said, "This is what your teacher is doing." And he accused her of sleeping with her students, and brought the laptop and the photos to a reporter at the New York Post. And so what appears in the New York Post are the photos of Annie dressed, in provocative lingerie. And the ex tells the writer at the New York Post that Annie was sleeping with her students. Annie, and it's untrue. Annie's fired, or she's put, in New York they call it the rubber room. You're segregated, you can't teach until this sort of system deals with the allegations made against you. And after 2 years, the Department of Education, after a hearing, finds she didn't do any of those things, right? She never slept with her students, that this was a determined ex. But as the Department of Education explained, they could not have her back as a teacher. Why? Because the Google search of her name, her students would see. And what was in the Google search of her name? All the articles accusing her of having slept with students, though clearly untrue, and some of the nude photos that the ex-insured would be seeded all over the internet, on porn sites, revenge porn sites, and just various sites like Reddit, right? And it's not as depressing, because at the end I'll explain how Annie sort of used her and leveraged her personal power in really productive ways. But it was a journey. Michael Herrick was a young guy dating in New York. He met someone on Grindr, they had a relationship, and when they broke up, the man impersonated him on Grindr, and then so used his nude photos that Michael had shared with him to impersonate him on Grindr and suggest that he had anal rape fantasies. And so after impersonating him persistently on the site, over 1,000 men came to his door demanding sex. And Michael hired my friend Carrie Goldberg to represent him, and Carrie wrote 50 letters to Grindr explaining what was happening. And Grindr's response was, we can't figure out who it is. We think he's using a VPN. There's nothing we can do. And I'll explain why it is that law would tolerate that. Websites enjoy an immunity from liability for the postings of their users. So these kinds of experiences are not unusual, unfortunately. There are over 800,000 people, according to the Department of Justice Bureau of Statistics, who experience cyberstalking in the way that I'm describing it, right? A persistent course of conduct made up of threats, privacy invasions, and defamation. And it profoundly impacts your life. So I've been working on this issue for about 10 years. And it's sort of amazing. When I first started writing about cyberstalking, the response to the idea that law should have anything to do with this was heretical. It's the internet, Danielle. You're going to break it. How dare you think about it? I was like, little me, I'm not breaking anything. But how dare you think you should bring law into this space, right? And what we've seen, talking about leveraging power, right? What we've seen, though, is an extraordinary change. So you might ask, okay, what's the story with law? How does law play in here? And there are, in about half of our states and at the federal level, cyberstalking laws that we can leverage to bring to bear to some of this problem, right? And when I first started working on the question of the posting of nude photos without consent, which we often call non-consensual pornography, others call it revenge porn. We haven't quite figured out a really great way to describe it besides the non-consensual posting of intimate images, which is a mouthful, right? When I first started working on the issue 10 years ago, there were 2 states in the nation that criminalized invasions of sexual privacy. And I'm the vice president of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. It's an advocacy group. And our president, Marianne Franks, has worked with lawmakers all across the country. And there are now, 4 years later, 42 states in DC criminalize non-consensual pornography. And I'm working with Senator Harris on a federal bill that would ban the non-consensual posting of intimate images. So we've made some progress about laws on the books, right? The key is like what we do with them, right? And more often, and as I was working on my book, Hate Crimes in Cyberspace, victims would go to law enforcement, and their response was, turn your computer off, ignore it, boys will be boys, come on. And law enforcement just has struggled with understanding how to address it, right? They didn't have the training often, they're great at street crimes. But sort of state and local law enforcement cities, they just don't know where to start investigating. How do we figure out who the poster is? How do we go to an online service provider, get a warrant, then go to the ISP with an IP address? It was like sort of beyond them, right? And they didn't know the laws on the books, right? That they had tools. They just had to figure out how to use them. And in 2014, I began working with then California Attorney General Kamala Harris, and what she called the Cyber Exploitation Task Force. And our greater effort was to teach, there are like 4,000, what they call them, peace officers in California, about the laws on the books that they can use to help address questions of non-consensual pornography and cyberstalking. And 2 years later, there's a website and training manual for law enforcement, and they've done a much better job in California. It's a great start, right? We need to work on that throughout the country, right? Training law enforcement, because if law just sits there, we know law's our teacher. It educates us, but it can't educate us, it can't deter if we don't use them, right? These kinds of tools. And civil suits are always, we might think, effective, but much better in theory than fact, because it's incredibly expensive to sue. Even if you know who your harasser is, they don't have a deep pocket, right? And so then you might say, okay, Danielle, but what about Grindr, right? They posted the imposters, right, abuse of their platform. Why aren't they the deep pocket, right, that we can go to? In 1996, Congress passed, it's called and I say this very slowly, the Decency Act, right? So it's passed in 1996, the Communications Decency Act, and the idea was to eradicate porn from the internet. Can you imagine? That was so not happening. But very conservative folks on either side of the aisle came together, and they passed the statute, which most of it gets struck down as unconstitutional, and rightly so. But what remains is a part of the statute that the title of it, Section 230, it's called Good Samaritan, Blocking and Filtering of Offensive Content. And the idea was to provide incentives for online service providers to filter and block speech that government couldn't touch because it's constitutionally protected speech, offensive, harassing, dirty words, so to speak, right? Congress wanted to give the immunity to online service providers so they had an incentive to filter and block offensive speech. The statute is written, though, in a way, it's been interpreted really broadly. so that even sites whose business model is abuse, revenge porn operators, they get to say, they solicit the posting exes to post nude photos, and they get to say, sue me, go ahead. I enjoy immunity from liability under Section 230, and they're right, right? As courts have interpreted this Good Samaritan statute, because it's written, it says no publisher or speaker shall be treated, no internet service provider should be treated as a publisher or speaker of someone else's content. And as it's written, even though the title says it's just for Good Samaritans, it doesn't condition the liability on being a Good Samaritan. So Grindr can just ignore, right, Herrick's letters and just say, too bad, so sad. Michael, go figure it out yourself, right? He changed his cell phone number. He had to move. It was incredibly challenging for him, right? And so I think an untapped source of power, to go back to our, the theme for the festival, are platforms, right? So I've been working with Twitter and Facebook for the last 8 years, and I'm on Twitter's Trust and Safety Task Force, and Facebook has a group called we're the Non-Consensual Intimate Images Task Force. And there are the dominant platforms. So you think, who are the dominant platforms? Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft's gaming platform, YouTube, right? I mean, that's the user-generated content tends to sort of fall on those 4 platforms. And we do see increasing, and A.G. Harris was a big part of sort of her convening of bringing 50 companies together in 2014 to say, this is a big problem, why don't we try to figure this out, right? So Google and Bing now allow people to make requests to say, please de-index that nude photo. I never let someone put it up. And so, what victims most want is not to have their nude photo in a Google search of their name, right? So we've made some important steps, right? And Facebook and Twitter ban threats, direct threats targeted at specific people, and harassment and stalking. But at scale, it's tough to do, right? And you can't filter or block with software threats and harassment and stalking because it's so contextual, right? You don't want to filter out, like Sean King, who's a Black Lives Matter activist. He was taken off of Facebook because an overly aggressive algorithm flagged his writing about hate speech he experienced online as hate speech. So who's taken off Facebook is someone who's a civil rights advocate, right, in the name of filtering hate speech. So it's an imperfect process, but I think we have to reconsider the very broad immunity that Congress has given platforms. It's been 25 years, right? They are well on their way to maturity, these young platforms, right? They no longer need the immunity. And then the question is, how can we fix it, right? And so I've been working on different proposals with lawmakers about how we do that in a way that incentivizes monitoring and filtering, but without censoring the internet, right? So those are platforms, right? But what about all of us, right? Grindr, should it be able to walk away from Michael Herrick? I don't think so, right? I think we should have legal incentives for platforms to engage in responsible practices. But what can we all do, right? So when I told you about Annie, I said, don't worry, it's not as depressing as you think, though. She had like 4 years in which her life, was tormented. She went to law school at night, at CUNY Law School. And Annie just passed the bar, and now Carrie Goldberg is really one of the country's most extraordinary. If you've got a cyberstalking problem, you want Carrie on the case, and she works for Carrie's law firm. And Michael Herrick, God bless, he's doing okay, but not great. Carrie brought a lawsuit on behalf of Michael against Grindr, and the lawsuit, of course, trial court said there's immunity from liability. And the Second Circuit just upheld the decision, dismissing his lawsuit. So we definitely have work to do. But there are victims who so the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative that I am a member of and a vice president of was founded by a woman who was a victim of revenge porn, whose boyfriend had posted on hundreds of revenge porn sites and porn sites So pages and pages and pages of a Google search of her name when Holly was in graduate school. And some with photos, a video of her masturbating next to the suggestion she was interested in sex. Some that said hot for teacher. You know, she was a grad student teaching undergrads at FIU. And so her dean called her into the office to say, Holly, what is this? And she explains, I think it's got to be my ex. I mean, I shared photos with him on the and videos on the understanding of confidentiality, right? We were in a relationship for 3 years. And when they break up, and the advice from her dean was change your name. She had a very unusual last name. And she did, right? She said, what else could I do? I wanted to finish my PhD program. And she couldn't have Google search like under her old name. But you know, after going into hiding for a while, Holly founded the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, right? And has been working with Marianne Franks and I, with lawmakers across the country. So in many ways, we see this deep disempowerment, right, of network tools can be, not in every case. I wish I could say every victim I've interviewed and talked to and written about has been able to do what Holly did. But it is a source of great, I think, inspiration to see folks like Holly and Annie take their experience and use it in such a productive and important way. So I'm sure I have time for lots of questions. I'm excited. Oh, yes, of course. I'm raising my mic. And I'm going to take it out too so I can wander a little. So I would love questions from the audience. And sorry, I know it's a little depressing and scary, but my hope is I end with Holly and Annie to say, there's a lot we can do. There's, right, as we come together on this issue. And we're all users of social media platforms, right? Once social media platforms get the message that it's bad for business, right? They got that message in 2014 from advocates like myself who worked with them. But we need to spread that message and press the case, right? Make it clear to Jack Dorsey it's not okay, right? And Mark Zuckerberg. They're great people at these companies working on online safety and speech on harassment issues, but if the C-suite doesn't listen, I can work with these people till I'm blue in the face, right? So we've got to make clear that users, all of us, right, individuals, right, consumers, that we are all kind of part of this conversation. So yeah. Oh yes, indeed. No worries. Poor Crystal, I hopped on the question game maybe earlier than I was supposed to.
No worries at all. So yeah, if everyone could speak into the mic and go ahead and just raise your hand for a mic and I'll bring one to you.
You mentioned early on that people were going to their local law enforcement and they were being told, oh, sorry, there's nothing we can do, even though there were rules on the books that they could have used if they'd known about it. So with these various initiatives occurring on this topic, is there also some efforts, you know, some sort of organized way of educating local police, law enforcement?
And that's what, I mean, so what A.G. Harris, when she was AG, Senator Harris, what she did, the hope was that it would be a model. Right? If you go to cyberexploitation.ca.gov, the website has both education for victims and law enforcement, right? That illuminates for the outward-facing website what the laws are in this space, and advocacy groups, and then numbers and names of offices, right? Law enforcement that you can go to. And there's a sort of inward-facing sort of training. Then your wonderful question is, okay, now what? California, yes, biggest market in the United States. But of all the other states, what's happening? And we haven't seen as much as I would like us to see, right? So I had a student, I'm at University of Maryland, and the law school's located in the city. And I had a student come to my office and say, I think it's my ex putting up photos of me on Craigslist, which the photos say I'm interested in sex and I'm a prostitute. And so we were able to get the photos, some of the photos and ads taken down, but he would be persistent. And so every time I would go down, it would come up, right? And so I said, listen, I think now it's time we go to law enforcement and go to Baltimore City, because we're in the city, and tell me what happens. And she comes back, and I feel terrible, weeping. And 2 female law enforcement officers basically said, like, what, you did something, like it was your fault. First of all, why'd you give him the photo? And what did you do to provoke this? So not only didn't they help her, but she was sobbing when she came back to my office to say, I did what you told me, Danielle, right? So I feel so guilty. And I said, give me a second, because I'm friends with folks at the Maryland AG's office. And I've worked really closely with AG's offices across the country on privacy questions. And so you make a call to the head of the criminal division, and they work right on it, right? Got someone to work on it, trace the post to the X gets arrested, right? But it's hard because not everyone can go to their professor, who is the person working on it, across the country. Like Marianne Franks is at Miami. It's right, we're some of the few people working on this. So we're at the beginnings of conversations about this that are making an impact on law enforcement. And the same is true of the federal level, right? That when victims go to, FBI or Secret Service, the response is often, we don't have the resources for this. This is just not what we do, even though there are fantastic laws on the books, almost a model for how states should write them. And there's one division of the Department of Justice in DC, the Computer Crimes Unit, and they're great at it. Mona Sedgwick brings cases involving sextortion and non-consensual pornography and cyberstalking, but she's one prosecutor. So there's a lot of work we have to do, right, about education.
I believe we had a question in the back.
Hi. You sort of touched on this just now, but my question is, in the case of Michael and the story of the teacher you shared, what ultimately happened to the disgruntled exes? And you talked about we're making progress in terms of holding these platforms to account. But where do we stand right now legally in holding the perpetrators of this abuse and defamation to account? Are there convictions? Are people going to jail? Do we have progress we need to make on that front?
Yes, okay. So, and it is tied really nicely to our question about how have we done in education, right? We made some small steps. So Herrick's perpetrator remains free to do what he wants. New York's law enforcement has not taken up the case. Annie's perpetrator, the same, right? Carrie Goldberg's in New York City, right? And part of the problem is that non-consensual pornography, until 3 weeks ago, wasn't a crime. And so we didn't have the legal tools in New York to address the issue. And both Michael and Annie are in New York. And so thankfully, it's the latest state, right, to adopt laws addressing non-consensual pornography, even though it's also cyberstalking, right? The persistent course of conduct that Herrick's abuser and that Annie's ex engaged in, laws on the books. But because there wasn't a law addressing non-consensual pornography, law enforcement got to say, we don't have the right tools, even though Carrie would say, and I would say, here they are. They're part of the New York Code, right? They're in McKinney's, the New York statutes. So it is a frustrating sort of step-by-step process. But as opposed to 8 years ago or 10 years ago, we do see more prosecutions, right? So it's not nothing. I don't want to just, we do see prosecutions, right? It is a slow process. And then the question about the platforms, we can't reach them, but what about civil suits, right? I think you asked about, like, can we sue them, the perpetrators? And we could. We have tools in our toolbox. We've got claims for defamation, for privacy torts that Warren and Brandeis sort of imagined in 1890 in their famous Right to Privacy article that become 4 torts. So one is intrusion on seclusion, and the other is public disclosure of private fact. And nude images posted without consent are not understood as newsworthy and protected speech, right? But it's so expensive to sue. So the Cyber Civil Rights Legal Project is a sort of sister organization, and it's a big law firm, K&L Gates, and they provide pro bono services for victims. But within a day of announcing their project 3 years ago, they had 100 clients, right? It's one law firm. So I encourage, if you're in a law firm, right, we need pro bono counsel because it's so expensive to sue. And most individuals who are targeted don't have the money to sue. And like Holly, she couldn't really get a job, right, outside of her university because a Google search of her name sort of she had a decimated reputation, right? Same with Annie. Took a long time. Annie had to go to law school, right? So it's not that we don't have the tools. It's so often that they're not used, either because it's expensive or because law enforcement's not doing anything, right? But we do see a little progress. So I don't think we give up hope. I think we just keep on keeping on talking about it.
We've got a question right down here.
So platforms like Facebook and Twitter are sort of deeply entrenched in American values. And so I wonder how other countries or governments sort of feel about the ways in which platforms conduct themselves. I mean, I think the one example I continuously think of is in Germany, is sort of NetzDG and the way that they approach or sort of think about these issues and how it sort of runs counter to, I think, a lot of the ideals that you know, the platforms themselves seem to possess.
Okay, so now she's gonna get really mad at me, but that's my kid, just saying. Cute Ellie Citron, student freshman at University of Chicago. So happy she's here. Okay, great question, Ellie. How you doing, babe? Okay, so the question about, will you forgive me? I hope so. We'll see you later, right? Platforms we know are global. Right, so Facebook and Twitter, they're global platforms, right, with billions of users. And so outside of the United States, there isn't a Section 230 Decency Act. So there's liability. And what we see are an adaptation of terms of service to country-specific questions. And so we see far greater moderation outside the United States. The United States almost, like we treated cyberstalking and threats as a free speech problem, even though, and we can talk about why, doctrine, the First Amendment doctrine and theory would say, we can use law to bear here, right? There's an important expressive interest in protecting individuals from cyberstalking and harassment. There's less protection in Europe, right? And then the question about, tell me about this Germany when we're going to talk about it. There are hate speech laws, right, outside the United States, which would be incompatible with our commitments under the First Amendment, but that are aggressive outside the United States. So Germany passed a hate speech law that compels platforms to remove hate speech, broadly defined, within 24 hours. And the result has been, and I think this is almost the worst of all worlds, that they're trusting algorithms outside the United States to remove hate speech, which of course is a very vague term. And once we say 99%, Zuckerberg testified before Congress, and he said, well, 99% of all hate speech and extremist speech is being filtered outside the United States, thanks to pressure from the EU Commission and this new law in Germany. And what I think that means is that it's not just hate speech. So it's not just the neo-Nazis, and extremist speech that are calling for violence against marginalized groups, but also political dissenters. And so I feel like we don't have any perfect solution. I suppose that's any interesting legal problem. There isn't a silver bullet, right? It's a combination of things. But it's been imperfectly addressed in the United States, and outside of the United States, there's not under-enforcement or under-censorship. We see expansive censorship when it comes to hate speech, but they struggle with harassment and stalking and do little, like our problems about non-consensual pornography in the United States are mimicked all around the world, and law enforcement, and that could be because it's a gendered and a crime that affects marginalized communities and women, law enforcement is equally unsympathetic and unresponsive. So we have the same problems of non-responsiveness and platforms, because it's so contextual, harassment, threats and non-consensual pornography, the same kinds of struggles, but we overly censor hate speech. You know, Ellie, as you brought up, the hate speech problem is like we are down to censor, and we almost censor too much outside the United States.
We've got a question in the back, in the middle. Oh, not anymore.
That was kind of my question.
Oh, okay. Look at that.
We've got another question over here.
The circumstances you've been talking about have been all adults. Is there
Yes.
anything in this world and the things that are happening that will help try and get rid of the damage that child pornography causes?
So what's interesting is that, and I think hopeful in some respect, is that when you, anytime we talk about invasions of privacy and child pornography, if you talk about kids, we respond. So law enforcement, child pornography is often an intractable problem because a lot of it is seeded on the dark web, right? And shared within private groups, messaging. And so it's a really tough problem. But law enforcement, federal and state, is really receptive. You say it's a kid involved, and they jump on it. So the problem of sextortion, do you guys know what sextortion is? I'm gonna help define it for everybody. It is when you have a nude photo of someone or you steal a nude photo of someone and you threaten to post it online unless they give you more. So you extort nude images from someone or extort sex acts, virtual sex acts from them. So you say, you have to masturbate for me on your webcam. When it comes to kids, law enforcement and sextortion, they are on it. And perpetrators will receive sentences over 30 years. When it's a grown-up, the response is like, no big deal. And so just to take an example, a man was sextorting adult women, and over hundreds of them. Like he had like it was like a thing, he would break into people's, hack into their computers or lie, and he said, I have a nude photo of you, and then extort more nude images and acts, and he did it to over 76 people, that is, who testified at trial against him, and he got 3 years in jail. So you see the difference, right? Like response to children versus, and it's the same crime, extortion, sextortion, but with really different results, right? That's not to answer your wonderful question, but what do we do about the endemic problem of child porn? And it's really hard because so much of it is traded on the dark web.
We've got a question all the way in the back here.
I guess this is a good piggyback off of that, not specifically about child pornography, but how do we speak to young people about this without using, I work with middle schoolers specifically, and without using scare tactics, without saying this is what's gonna happen, it's gonna ruin your life. How do you talk to young people about it?
Right, no, and I, for years, because I had two girls in an all-girls school, and I would always come and talk to the middle schoolers, the high schoolers, and the parents, right? And you don't want to scare them. You do want to say that if you take nude photos of yourself and you're under 18, that's considered child porn. Law enforcement isn't great at this, and they may prosecute you. I mean, we've seen cases in North Carolina where law enforcement, kids would consensually sext, send nude photos to each other, and didn't show it to anyone else. Someone got wind of it, and the young students, 15, 14 years old, were threatened with child pornography prosecution. Now that's law gone really awry, right? We don't want to do that. If the whole idea is to prevent predation, right? Prosecuting two young people in love seems an absurdity, right? So what I do say when I talk to middle schoolers in high school about this, I say there's nothing wrong with taking nude photos of yourself when you're over 18, right? And do it in the context of trust, right? So much of this is about trust. I don't want us, when I grew up, when we fell in love, I always say this, think of my husband, how did we share intimacies? We made each other mixtapes. I'm 50, so this is clearly, right? This was as crazy as we got. But our most intimate selves, we felt was our music, right? And it took hours, right? You have to make the mixtape. No, is everyone with me who's kind of my age? And that was our love letter, right? Young people have their, see, people are with me. Young people have their cameras now, right? And there's nothing wrong with sexual expression at all, right? We all have our different ways of intimacy and development relationships. But key to that, what I say to young people, is trust, right? You know, the key to privacy is trust, right? And so sexual expression must be paired with privacy and confidentiality. And so I definitely don't scare them, right? But I also say we're citizens in a digital age. And our responsibility is to others and to ourselves, right? And sometimes there's nothing you can do. Someone creates a deepfake sex video of you, you had nothing to do with it, right? You didn't do anything wrong. So what I think we've got to inculcate in teachers and kids and parents is to teach people when they're young that these tools are powerful, that they're indispensable to our lives, and we have to treat other people with respect, right? And not torment them. Does that make sense? So that's my sort of approach to when I talk to kids.
Let's see. Why don't we go right in the middle here?
Hi, thank you for speaking on an obviously very important topic. I want to touch back on something you started on. I'm an employer. I've hired more than 10,000 people. Yeah. I actually use Facebook as one of my recruiting sources. I've never once done a Google search on an applicant, never once looked at a Facebook profile. It works just fine. You don't have to do that. How can we convince other employers that they don't need to be going tracking people's social profiles?
Okay, so can we have a moment to say thank you? Yes, we love you. That's unusual, right? Most employers use Google and Facebook, right, and Twitter as a CV search, right? It's part of the process. And we know that, so 90%, this is from a Microsoft study from 2009, 90% of employers use online search engines to research candidates. And from the study, over 77% of the time there's a negative result. And we know whose shoulders that falls on, right, are women and people from marginalized communities. And one of the highest category of why there's a negative result was inappropriate photos, right? So God bless you, love you, appreciate it. How can we convince employers? Law may need to step in, right? What's interesting, and the legal tools aren't well fashioned for this. So Title VII is our commitment to anti-discrimination in employment. And we might think of it as having a disparate impact on individuals, but how we interpret that law, Title VII, is really narrowly. And so the idea that we would use state and federal anti-discrimination law in making decisions based on, on gender or on sex, on race, on national origin, because someone has a nude photo or, comments that provoke sort of bias, we don't leverage those laws. We can't under current understandings, and maybe we should. And a small move forward in that direction was in certain states, and I think my state is, and there's 6 states, to prevent employers from asking their employees for their Facebook passwords, right? Their social media passwords, right? So that was a move, right? God bless 6 states, including Maryland. But that's 6 states, right? And so, and increasingly, and this you no doubt can tell us about, employers using data mining and algorithms to make scoring, ranking, and rating potential employees. And what they're doing when they're scoring and ranking and rating, companies like Gilt and others that are in this business of making recommendations about employees, they're searching the internet. And all the stuff I'm talking about is there. So inherently is then part of one score, right? So I think we should need a reset in the way we think about law. And also, everyone should follow your lead, but it's not yet the norm, right? You're probably very much an outlier, unfortunately, the Microsoft study suggests.
Got a question right back there.
Hi.
Hey.
So I guess I'm wondering, since the response to these online crimes is so hard to get any sort of resolution from, what sort of work is being done to educate people broadly or society broadly that what happens in online space is not abstract, that it has very real world repercussions and affects people very directly. If you could speak to that at all.
So there are a number, not a lot, but of advocacy groups that engage in education, and that includes the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative that I'm a part of, a group called Without My Consent, as well as Common Sense Media, which I work pretty closely with them about educating kids. But there's not enough, right? And there's not enough funding for a lot of these efforts, right? CCRI, the group I'm part of, I don't get paid for anything, neither does Marianne Franks. We like operate on a shoestring. So I think we need to work on greater funding for a lot of these efforts, because if we don't start with education, sort of like this is something that Martha Nussbaum, we put out she and Saul Levmar have a wonderful book called The Offensive Internet, and I have a chapter in it. And Martha writes about, in her chapter, and she writes about online harassment, about how if we don't educate, especially young boys, about how to think about and treat women, we're lost, you know? And she's right. So in my book, I have a whole chapter on like parents and students and what do we do, right? It is such a key part of resetting norms is talking to young people and their parents. And what I found a bit depressing as I get pulled into various scenarios, especially locally in Baltimore, and I would call a parent up and say, on behalf of a friend, really? And the parent would say, well, my son never secretly taped these kids having sex and didn't share it with the rest of the boys' school. And I said, no, really, he did. And they would say, I don't believe you, fuck off, excuse my language. And not, oh, forget, where's Allison, will you forgive me? And not take responsibility, right? If your kid does something wrong, you talk to your kid, right? They can't get to walk away. If we don't model that sort of responsibility, we are so sunk as a society. So you sort of see that, at least I saw it on a really sort of micro level as I would try to help other parents locally work on these issues. And to get the, I don't care if my kid did it, your kid's to blame, right? She's a slut would often be the response. I just, I give up. I can't reach the kid if I can't reach their parents, right? So that's a struggle for all. I think we all can participate in that one.
We've got a question right down here.
I was wondering, I don't know much about it, but could you tell me a little bit about what sort of response you're getting from the corporate world on the European Union's right to forget, and what you think of that as a legal model for other countries or areas?
Okay, so great question. And I'm going to talk a little bit to everyone about this right to be forgotten, which in Europe, so we now have this new privacy law called the General Data Privacy Directive, GDPR rule. And prior to May 25th, 2018, the adoption of GDPR, we had a court ruling in the European Court of Justice, which found that there was a man in Spain where when you Googled his name, what came up was an old debt. He had an old debt on a house, and it was prominent in a search of his name. It was a news story. And he went to Google and said, Google, take it down. I have the right to have this forgotten about me. And the European Court of Justice ultimately found that Google, as a processor of private information, had an obligation, Google itself, the platform, had an obligation to make a determination of whether a news story should be de-indexed in the search of someone's name, because Google searchers are so powerful, they're so potent. European Court of Justice so explains, and recognizes this right to be forgotten, that then becomes embedded in this now blank, like broad European privacy law called GDPR. Why you got privacy notices May 25th last year, 1 million of them, right, is because of the adoption of this new European law. And it puts the responsibility on a private company, to be the decider, to decide if something should be forgotten or if, on the other hand, it's so newsworthy that it shouldn't be, right? And so then you asked me, well, what are companies doing? Was that the question? Like, are they being responsive? And so yes, what's interesting is that Google is being responsive to this right to be forgotten and being transparent, which I think is particularly important, about the number of requests they're getting per country and how many requests are taken down. So only 44% of their requests to be forgotten are taken down, on the grounds that it's not just private information, it's also newsworthy.
Hi there. My question's on normalization. So you've been talking about things on the very local level. There's lots of stuff going on the national level, like Alex Jones, for example. So how much of that is actually impacting and growing what's happening more on the local level? You're talking about Annie, empowering people, thinking that they can do whatever because they see normalization coming from the top.
Yeah, no, it's such a great point, and I'll talk a little bit about Alex Jones. So in working on this issue, I felt like we were making a whole bunch of progress. And then with the election of 2016, in many respects, there's a permission structure from the Trump campaign, right, about the permissiveness of hate. And I think we've now seen an escalation of hate online, in a way, an empowerment, right? Charlottesville was no surprise. And we have seen cultures of hate develop that have gone from the fringes of bulletin boards to the mainstream. And in response, we know you raised Alex Jones because Facebook has just shoved him offline, right? Closed down his account, along with 4 other very prominent people who you would say are engaged in very high-profile hate speech and bigotry. And what Twitter has kicked off Alex Jones now, because it calls it like dangerous speech, right? We wrestle with this as a country, and I think it's gotten worse, not better. That is the notion of normalizing hateful, demeaning, subordinating ideas. And the question is, how do we best fight that? Are we best fighting it by kicking off Alex Jones and driving him to Gab, where we don't see what he's doing? I wonder. I am not convinced that's the smartest thing to do. But of course, the reason why we have people walking in Charlottesville with tiki torches and unafraid, not masked, right, is because they feel like it's normal because he is online. So I think that's a tough call for companies. But I say this by thanking thank you so much, Chicago Humanities Festival, and all of you for wonderful questions and for coming on this beautiful day. So thank you so much.